Hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Macro Waves, the podcast from BNP Paribas Economic Research. Today we're looking at public finances in advanced economies. Between rising interest rates, aging populations, and the needs associated with climate change and defense spending, the budget equation is becoming increasingly tricky, with the risk of seeing public debt increase. Hi, I'm Stéphane Colliac, head of the Advanced Economies team at BNP Paribas Economic Research, and I'm joined by my colleague Marianne Müller, European economist, and Benjamin Puiseux, our wonderful economic intern within the team.
Hello.
Hello, and thank you, Stéphane, for setting the scene. Let's start with the main observation. Can you describe the current state of public finances in advanced economies?
Public deficits remain high, particularly in the US, France, and the UK. However, while the latter two are engaged in fiscal consolidation, this is still not the case in the US. The situation is different in Spain and Italy, where fiscal consolidation is much more advanced. Germany and Japan, on the other hand, are likely to see the public deficits increase.
What is the current state of public debt and how is it likely to evolve?
Public debt has increased and will continue to increase in countries that account for nearly 80% of global GDP according to the IMF. While public debt is increasing, it is primarily due to fiscal deficit. Therefore, it is not surprising to find the US, France, and the UK on the list of countries whose debt will continue to grow between now and the end of the decade. Conversely, more modest deficits will enable Spain and Italy to reduce their public debts.
Marianne, let's talk about Germany now. What can you tell us about it?
In Germany, public debt will increase by nearly 7 points between its 2024 level and what we anticipate for 2030, as the public deficit will grow significantly between 2025 and 2027 in order to finance defense and infrastructure investment plans. However, it should be noted that we are talking about debt levels that are and will remain limited and a time-constrained deficit increase. This is because the German authorities are expected to bring their public deficit back to the 3% of GDP needed to stabilize the debt by the end of the decade.
Benjamin, we regularly hear that rising interest rates complicate the management of public finances and in particular contribute to an increase in debt. How does it work?
It is important to understand that the evolution of public debt in the coming years is a consequence of the current state of public finances. We have just talked about the deficit. However, interest rates are another important factor. For more than 10 years, advanced countries benefited from very low rates, which, incidentally, made it easier to manage debt after the COVID crisis. But the situation has now changed. First, inflation rose and rates followed, but less than inflation. And it was when inflation moderated, starting in 2024, that the rise in nominal interest rates began to bear down, because that was when real interest rates began to rebound. When real interest rates rise, the budget equations becomes trickier.
What can we expect in the coming years?
What is crucial here is to understand that the full effect of the rise in rates has not yet been felt. Indeed, thanks to the long maturity of debt, the average in real interest rate that governments pay on the debt, also known as the apparent rate, remains well below the interest rate currently observed on the markets, and even more so, below GDP growth.
How does this comparison between interest rates and growth affect the evolution of public debt?
What matters here is the comparison between the real apparent interest rate, called R, and the real growth rate, G. When R is lower than G, a country can both maintain a moderate deficit and reduce its public debt. However, when R approaches or exceeds G, primary surpluses, by primary we mean excluding interest charges, must be generated, otherwise public debt will increase.
Marianne, how are the different countries positioned?
They're not starting from the same point. Italy is already being forced to generate primary surpluses. The United States may have to follow the same path due to the short average maturity of its debt, around 6 years, which means that the rate increases are quickly passed on to most of the debt to be repaid. In other countries, R should catch up with G by the end of the decade. Germany and Japan are special cases, as they are the countries that have benefited the most from negative rates. In these countries, the convergence of R towards G is expected to only occur in the next decade.
Let's now talk about another issue that is already affecting public finances, and I'm referring here to aging populations. Marianne, can you describe the main effects for us?
Healthcare and pension spending is increasing in all advanced economies. In the United States, it is expected to reach 11.2% of GDP in 2050, compared to 8.3% today. The situation is even more striking in Japan, where pensions and healthcare will account for nearly 23% of GDP in 2040. At the same time, the ratio of working people to retirees has fallen sharply. It is already less than 2 in countries such as Japan, Italy, Germany, and France, and it is expected to continue to deteriorate.
But do governments have levers at their disposal to enable public finances to better absorb this impact? Stéphane, can you give us an example?
Yes. One of the policy tools available for limiting the impact of aging on social spending is the employment rate of older citizens. Several countries have undertaken reforms aimed at raising the retirement age or encouraging people to continue working after retirement, as has recently been announced in Germany. This is crucial. In France, for example, if the employment rate for 55 to 64 years olds simply reached the European average, it will improve the public deficit by nearly 0.8% of GDP per year.
The other major constraint currently being discussed is defense. We are seeing a real paradigm shift here.
Europe has committed to increase its defense spending to 3.5% of GDP by the end of the decade, compared with around 1.9% in 2024. For France, this accounts for around plus 0.2 percentage points of GDP per year until 2030. For Germany, this effort is aided by lower debt, but for countries such as Italy and France, there is less room for maneuver. However, it is clear that in most countries, the difference between what is spent on defense today and what will be spent at the end of the decade accounts for between 1 and 1.5% of GDP, a margin of maneuver that will be needed to be found. If not, public debt will increase by the same amount.
Stéphane, given that spending is set to increase for all the reasons that we have just mentioned, won't growth be a decisive factor?
Yes. As we have said, limiting fiscal deficits is a decisive precondition to stabilize public debt, and rising interest rates complicate this situation. In addition, of course, all of this would be further complicated if a docile risk materializes on growth. This is a frequently held view. However, let's not forget to consider the opposite favorable risk, because at the moment, growth is actually accelerating in the US and the Eurozone. And our calculations show that 0.5 percentage points of growth, either above or below target, would be enough to change the trajectory of debt between now and 2030.
How so?
Well, first of all, some of the spending has an impact on growth, particularly the European additional defense spending, and we are among those who believe that this effect will be more pronounced, particularly in Germany. Secondly, all countries are investing in artificial intelligence. This is a massive investment effort, and based on the experience of the US, which is always a little ahead of the developments that we will then see in Europe, it implies significant productivity gains. This is precisely the type of shocks that could have significant impact on growth, both reducing fiscal deficits and enabling real economic growth to once again exceed the real effective interest rates. Such developments would stabilize the public debt much earlier as 2028 in France or Germany, for example.
To sum up, public finances have to contend with many issues, including new spending priorities such as defense spending, aging population, and rising interest rates. Therefore, it will be more difficult than before to contain public debt. Clear choices will have to be made, such as defining spending priorities, choosing which reforms to implement, and identifying the growth levels to focus on. The longer that the consolidation of public finances is delayed, the greater that the deficit reduction effort required to stabilize the debt will be. Thank you very much, Stéphane and Benjamin, for these insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more, I would recommend reading the latest issue of our Eco Perspectives on Advanced Economies, as well as our Eco Chart on Public Finances in Advanced Economies, both available on the BNP Paribas Economic Research website. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you soon for a new edition of Macro Waves.